Before we get into this story, if you believe that how you treat people says everything about who you are, you're in the right place. Hit subscribe and ring that bell, because every week we bring you moments that prove character is the only thing that truly counts. Now, let me tell you about the day a CEO walked onto the Family Feud stage and made the worst mistake of his life. There is a particular kind of arrogance that money produces in certain people. Not confidence, confidence is earned, and it shows up quietly. This is something else. It is the arrogance of a man who has spent so many years being agreed with that he has completely forgotten how to be corrected. On a Tuesday afternoon in the Family Feud studio, that kind of arrogance walked through the door in a tailored suit, shook hands with the production staff with the practiced warmth of someone performing lickability, and proceeded to spend the next hour reminding everyone around him exactly where they stood in relation to him. Which was far below. His name was Bryce Calloway. He was the CEO of a mid-sized logistics company in Charlotte, North Carolina, worth, by his own frequent mention, somewhere in the region of $40 million. He was 53 years old, silver-templed, and possessed of the absolute certainty that rooms existed to receive him. The family standing across the stage from him that day was the Delgado family from San Antonio, Texas. Frank Delgado was 61 years old. He had worked as a building janitor for 26 years. He had raised 4 children. He had never in his life spoken about how much money he made because it had never once occurred to him that money was the most interesting thing about a person. What happened between these two men and what Steve Harvey did about it lasted less than 10 minutes on stage. But it has lived online for years because some moments are too clear, too perfectly human to ever really disappear. Building emotional investment, the Delgado family Frank Delgado had been waking up at 4:30 in the morning for 26 years. Not 4:45. Not 5, 4:30. Because the building he maintained, a 12-story office complex in downtown San Antonio, needed to be clean and ready before the first employees arrived at 7. And doing that job properly, doing it the way Frank believed it deserved to be done, required 2.5 hours of uninterrupted work before the world came through the front doors and started making it complicated again. Frank was not a man who talked about his work the way some people do, apologetically, as though the job itself required an explanation. He had cleaned those floors and fixed those broken fixtures and handled every flooded bathroom and burned out corridor light for more than 2 decades with the steady, purposeful competence of someone who understood that a building does not run on the people in the offices. It runs on the people no one thinks to notice. His wife, Maria, worked part-time at a school cafeteria 3 days a week and had spent the remaining years of their marriage raising the 4 children who were now, in various stages of adulthood, scattered across Texas. Their eldest daughter, Rosa, was 32 and a licensed practical nurse. Their son, Eddie, was 28 and finishing a degree in civil engineering at the University of Texas at San Antonio, a degree he was paying for himself, with some help from his parents, working weekends at a hardware store to cover the gap. The younger 2 were still in high school. Frank and Maria had been married 34 years. They had never taken a vacation that required a plane. Their house was a 3-bedroom in a quiet part of San Antonio's west side that Frank had repainted himself 3 times because he refused to pay someone else for work he could do with his own hands. Their living room had a framed photograph of the Pope, a shelf of Maria's ceramic figurines, and a large television that the whole family gathered around on football Sundays. It was Rosa who had submitted the application for Family Feud. She had done it on a slow night at the hospital, filling out the form between rounds because she wanted her parents to have something fun, something that was just for them, no bills attached, no obligation. She had written in the application that her father was the hardest working man in any room he has ever entered and the most decent person I have ever known in my life. The producers had called 3 weeks later. Frank had made Maria read the letter twice before he believed it. He had ironed his shirt the night before the taping, not had it dry cleaned, ironed it himself at 11 o'clock at night, the way he did everything carefully and by hand. Bryce Calloway, the other family, the Calloway family, had arrived at the studio in a hired car. Bryce had mentioned this to the production assistant who greeted them at the door, not because it was relevant, but because it was the kind of detail Bryce considered worth establishing early. His wife, Pamela, was polished and cordial in the way of a woman who had attended many events at which her husband was the most important person in the room, and had learned to carry that gracefully. Their 2 adult children, both in their late 20s, both working in some capacity for their father's company. flanked them with the slightly glazed energy of people who had been in close proximity to Bryce's self-regard for their entire lives. In the green room before the taping, Bryce had asked one of the production assistants, a young woman who was simply doing her job, whether the show typically attracted this level of, everyday people. He had said it with a smile, as though the observation were charming rather than condescending. She had smiled back and said nothing. He had also mentioned his net worth twice before filming began. Once to a crew member who had not asked, and once in the context of explaining why he preferred a particular brand of bottled water that the green room did not carry. Nobody on the production team had said anything about any of this. Television tapings are long and people are strained, and it was not anyone's job to correct a contestant's personality before he walked through the door. That, as it turned out, would be Steve Harvey's job. Tension escalation, Arrogance Meets Dignity Part 1. First impressions, the two families took their places on either side of the stage. The Delgados were animated and warm. Rosa kept squeezing her father's arm. Eddie was cracking jokes with the warm-up comedian. Maria was beaming with the specific joy of a woman who does not get enough occasions to beam. Frank stood in the middle of his family and looked exactly like what he was, a man who was proud of where he had come from and completely at ease with who he was. The Callaways were polished and energetic in a different key, louder, more performative, the kind of enthusiasm that is aware of itself. Bryce, in particular, commanded his side of the stage with the ease of a man accustomed to the front of any room he enters. Steve Harvey worked his way through both families with his signature blend of genuine curiosity and perfectly timed humor. The Delgados gave him a lot to work with. Maria told him about Frank's 4:30 alarm, and the studio audience groaned with sympathetic disbelief. Eddie said his father had never once called in sick in 26 years, and Steve stopped walking and turned back to look at Frank directly. 26 years, Steve said. Not once. Not once, Frank said simply. Steve shook his head slowly in the way he does when something lands on him honestly. That is a work ethic that a lot of people in this room could learn from, he said. The audience applauded. Frank nodded once, with the modesty of a man who considers reliability too basic a virtue to require acknowledgement. Steve moved to the Callaway side. Bryce launched into his introduction with the fluency of a man who has given many versions of it. The company, the revenue figures, the charitable board positions, the car. Steve listened, nodded, asked a few light follow-up questions, kept things moving. The audience was politely engaged. Nothing was wrong yet. It came during the opening face-off. Frank had stepped to the center podium and Bryce had stepped up to meet him, the two men facing each other the way contestants do, with Steve between them and the camera on both their faces. Steve read the question. Both men lunged for the buzzer. Frank got it a half-second faster. And Bryce, as Frank stepped back to his family with his answer, said it, quietly enough that it might have been intended only for his family, loudly enough, as it happened, for the microphone to catch it. With a small, indulgent smile that he did not bother to conceal. Beginner's luck, he said. The janitor got lucky. He said it the way people say things they consider harmless, with the confidence of a man who has never once been made to account for a casual cruelty. Not shouted, not heated, just dropped into the room like it was nothing, like Frank Delgado was nothing. Like 26 years of 4:30 mornings and raised children and an iron shirt on a special occasion were a punchline available to anyone with a better job title. The studio heard it. The audience heard it. Frank heard it. He did not turn around. He did not change his expression. He looked forward and gave his answer and let it go the way a man goes who has spent a lifetime letting things go because he is too busy doing the actual work to stop and argue about his place in the world. But Steve Harvey had heard it too, and Steve Harvey stopped walking. The game had not officially paused. There was no dramatic moment of production stopping, no signal to the crew. What happened was simpler and more human than that. Steve Harvey simply ceased to move forward. He stood where he was in the middle of that stage, and the expression on his face shifted with the kind of precision that comes from a lifetime of reading rooms. He looked at Bryce. Bryce was looking at his family, still carrying the tail end of the smile, confident that the moment had already passed. It had not. Say that again, Steve said. It was not a request with heat in it. It was the calm, measured tone of a man who wants to give someone the opportunity to hear what they just said. Bryce looked over, registered Steve's expression, recalibrated slightly. I was just saying he got lucky, he said, the smile adjusted now to something more neutral. It's a compliment. It's a compliment, Steve repeated. He let that sit in the air for a moment. You called him the janitor in a tone that was not a compliment. The studio had gone very quiet. The kind of quiet that audiences produce when they are not sure what is about to happen but understand that it matters. Bryce's smile disappeared entirely. I didn't mean anything by it, he said. I know you didn't, Steve said, and he said it in a way that was somehow more devastating than anger would have been. Because what he meant was, that is exactly the problem. You didn't mean anything by it. You just said it because it didn't occur to you that it required thought. Steve Harvey delivers the moment justice served with dignity. Steve Harvey turned away from Bryce and walked toward Frank Delgado. Frank was standing with his family, composed and still, the way he had been throughout. He was not performing dignity. He simply had it, the way people do who have never needed to announce it. Frank, Steve said. Can I ask you something? Sure, Frank said. Tell me about your kids. Frank blinked slightly, not what he had expected. He glanced at Rosa beside him, then back at Steve, and he began to talk about Rosa and the nursing career, about Eddie and the engineering degree being paid for weekend by weekend at a hardware store, about the two younger ones still in school, the daughter who wanted to be a teacher, the youngest son who had just made the varsity soccer team. He spoke the way parents speak about their children when someone asks with genuine interest, carefully at first, then with gathering warmth, until the words were coming easily and the audience was leaning in. Steve listened to all of it without interrupting. When Frank finished, Steve turned back to the studio, not to Bryce specifically, but to the whole room. Let me tell you what I just heard, Steve said. I heard about a man who has woken up at 4:30 in the morning for 26 years, who has never called in sick, who has raised 4 children, one of whom is a nurse and one of whom is almost an engineer, who ironed his own shirt to come here today because this was a special occasion and he wanted to look right for it. He paused. That is not a man who got lucky. That is a man who has been winning every single day, quietly, without asking for anyone's attention or approval. The audience was already responding, a warm, rolling tide of agreement moving through the room. Steve turned back toward the Calloway side. Bryce was standing very still now, his arms at his sides, the earlier ease completely gone. I've been doing this show for a long time, Steve said, his voice still level, still controlled, the way it is when he means every word and does not need volume to prove it. And I have met every kind of person you can imagine standing on this stage. Doctors, teachers, bus drivers, farmers, veterans, parents who are doing it alone. And I will tell you this from everything I have seen, the size of a man has nothing to do with his title. Nothing. It has to do with how he treats the people who cannot do anything for him. He let that land. You have a company worth $40 million. That is genuinely impressive. I'm not going to take that from you. But that does not buy you the right to look at a man like Frank Delgado and reduce him to his job title. That's not wealth. That's poverty of a different kind. The studio erupted, not the polite, prompted applause of a television audience following a cue. The real thing, spontaneous, sustained, the kind that builds on itself. Bryce opened his mouth. Steve raised one hand, gently but with complete finality. I'm going to ask you to sit this next round out, Steve said. Let your family play, take a minute on the side, and think about what just happened here. It was not theatrical. He did not shout it, did not make a spectacle of the removal. He simply said it quietly and clearly, the way you say something that is not a request. And Bryce, to his credit and perhaps to his surprise, stepped back from the podium and sat down in one of the side chairs without argument. Something in Steve's delivery had made argument impossible. Rosa Delgado was crying. Frank put his arm around her. Maria had both hands pressed to her face. Eddie was looking at Steve Harvey with the expression of a young man who had just watched someone do something he would not forget. Steve walked back to the center of the stage and looked at Frank. You good, he said. Frank nodded. I'm good, he said, and then quietly, thank you. Don't thank me, Steve said. Just keep doing what you do because clearly it works. The audience came to their feet. What followed for Frank, for Bryce, and for the people watching the game continues the rest of the taping proceeded. Bryce rejoined his family for the later rounds, quieter now, his performance entirely gone, replaced by something that looked, to those watching closely, like genuine reflection rather than simple embarrassment. The Calloways played out the remainder of the game with a noticeably different energy. Pamela, his wife, had taken over the natural leadership of their side. She was warmer and more genuine than her husband had been, and the audience responded to her accordingly. The Delgados played with the full, unguarded joy of a family that had come to have fun and had been reminded, in the most public possible way, that they had every right to it. Frank was not transformed by the moment into some louder version of himself. He was simply himself, more fully answering questions with his characteristic directness, laughing at Eddie's jokes, squeezing Maria's hand between rounds. They did not win the top prize that day. They played well, advanced confidently through the middle rounds, and lost narrowly in the final to the Calloways, whose performance in the fast money round was sharp enough to overcome the weight of the preceding hour. Nobody in that studio was particularly focused on the score. When the clip found the world, the producers made the decision to air Steve's exchange in full, with the blessing of both families. The Delgados had no hesitation. Bryce Calloway, to his credit, agreed as well, and it was later reported that he had personally asked the production team to include it unedited, which suggested that something had shifted in him between the taping and the broadcast. The clip went online within hours of the episode airing and moved the way certain things move when they capture something people have been waiting to see articulated, fast, wide, and with real emotion attached. Within 4 days, it had been viewed more than 20 million times. By the end of the first month, the number had nearly doubled. What the comment sections revealed was striking. A very large share of the responses were not about Bryce Calloway at all. They were about Frank Delgado, or rather, about the Frank Delgados in people's own lives. Fathers and grandfathers who had worked physical jobs for decades without recognition. Mothers who had cleaned other people's offices and gone home to raise their own families. People who had spent careers being passed over by men like Bryce and who, watching Steve Harvey speak on a Tuesday afternoon on a game show, felt something settle in them that had been unsettled for a long time. "My grandfather worked sanitation for 31 years, one widely shared comment read. Never complained once, sent 3 kids to college, this video is for him. I work maintenance at a hospital," wrote another person. "A surgeon walked past me yesterday and didn't respond when I said good morning. I showed this video to my kids tonight so they know how not to be." Steve Harvey did not comment publicly on the clip's spread. He had said what he said in the room where it needed to be said, and he left it at that. Bryce Calloway's response several weeks after the episode aired, a statement attributed to Bryce Calloway circulated in local Charlotte business media. It was brief, written without the assistance of a publicist based on everything about its tone, and it read in part that he had watched himself on television and had not recognized the person he saw. That he had called his company's facilities staff into a meeting, all 14 of them, and had apologized to them directly, by name, for a culture of indifference he had allowed to persist. That he had restructured the company's recognition program to include facilities and maintenance workers in the same quarterly acknowledgement process as executive staff. Whether the change lasted, whether it reached into the daily texture of how Bryce Calloway moved through the world, is not something that could be verified from the outside. What could be verified is that he made the statement that the meeting happened, and that at least some of the people who had worked invisibly in his building for years received, for the first time, a direct acknowledgement from the man at the top. It was not enough to undo what had been said on that stage. It was a start. Frank Delgado, after Rosa gave a short interview to a San Antonio local news outlet that was picked up regionally after the clip spread. She said her father had watched the episode once, with the whole family gathered in the living room on a Sunday night, and had not said much about it afterward. He had gone to work the following Monday at 4:30, as he always did. He had come home at his usual time. He had eaten dinner with Maria and watched the evening news. "That's who he is," Rosa said. "He doesn't need a television moment to tell him he's done something right. He's known that for a long time, but I think it mattered not because he needed the validation, but because it was true. Someone said it out loud in front of a lot of people, and it was just true. And that's the thing about the truth. It doesn't surprise people who have been living it. It just feels like finally arriving somewhere you always knew you were headed." Frank himself, when reached briefly by the same outlet, declined an extended interview. He said only, "I have a good family, I do my work, I don't need anything else from it." Which was exactly the kind of thing a man like Frank Delgado would say. What it means Steve Harvey did not do anything on that stage that required unusual courage or exceptional moral clarity. What he did was simply refuse to let a small cruelty pass unexamined, which, in practice, turns out to be rarer than it should be. He had the microphone and the standing and the instincts to recognize that what Bryce Calloway had said was not a joke, not a slip, but a window into the way certain people arrange the world in their own minds. And he chose to address it directly and without cruelty of his own. The genius of how he handled it was in the order of things. He spoke to Frank first. He asked about the children, drew out the full picture of what 26 years of dignified, unglamorous work had actually produced, made the audience feel the weight and the beauty of that life, before he turned to Bryce and offered his assessment. By that point, no one in the room needed Steve to explain why the remark had been wrong. They could see it themselves. This is how the best kind of correction works. Not as a punishment delivered from above, but as a simple, clear illumination of what is already true. Bryce Calloway had reduced Frank Delgado to his job title. Steve Harvey restored him to his full dimensions. And in doing so, he reminded everyone watching in the studio and at home and across the internet in the days that followed that dignity is not assigned by salary or title or the size of a company. It is built year by year in the decisions a person makes about how to treat other people and what to do with their time on Earth. Frank Delgado had been building it for 61 years. He went to work at 4:30 the Monday after his episode aired, the same as always. The floors of that building were clean before the first employees arrived. Nobody who walked through the lobby that morning knew they were in the presence of a man who, the week before, had stood on a television stage and been seen, fully, publicly, completely, for exactly who he was. But Frank knew. And for a man like Frank Delgado, that was always going to be enough. If this story reminded you of someone you know, someone who shows up every day without asking for recognition, share this video with them. Let them know you see them. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. Every week we find the moments that prove character is the only thing that truly lasts. We'll see you in the next one.